Welcome to the SBCA podcast, Component Connection, where we explore the people, ideas, trends, and innovations shaping the structural framing industry. Regardless of how you touch this industry, we're glad you're here. Enjoy the episode.
Hello, I'm Sean Shields, Director of Marketing for SBCA, and I'll be your host for this episode of Component Connection. I'm joined today by Jay Jones, Executive Director of the Truss Plate Institute. In this episode, we're going to discuss two industry standards TPI has started to develop and gain some insight into how they may impact the structural building components industry. Jay, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, hello, Sean. Thanks for having me back.
It's great to have you here. So it feels like just yesterday that TPI finished its update to the ANSI TPI 1 2022 standard. How time flies. But you recently announced that you are initiating review of two other standards, TPI 2 and TPI 3. Can we start by having you remind our listeners why the Truss Plate Institute develops standards and why you periodically revise them?
Sure. Yeah, you're right. I think last time we were on, you were talking about the updates TPI 1 standard, and here we are again. It's literally an ongoing and endless cycle, but that's a good thing. So like we discussed last time, our industry recognized early on in the 60s that the standard was needed for the metal plate connected wood truss industry. The pioneers in our industry thought or knew that the only way to do this was to establish a design standard that engineers and code officials could rely on. So that's really how the idea of the truss standard began, and the TPI 1 standard provided that foundation and gave the truss industry credibility. Mm-hmm. So if you fast forward 60 plus years now, I guess, we're still updating and refining the original TPI 1 standard. I think it started out as like a 14-page document. Now we're up over 100 pages with a commentary to match. So we've done a lot of work over the years. So obviously creating a standard isn't just a one and done deal. It's, as the industry evolves and we learn more from field experience and testing, and we come out with new products, it's important for our design standards to keep up. So, but that's not the only reason. We also have to, as an accredited standards writer, TPI, we're required to open the standard every 5 years. So, on the TPI 1 standard, that date will come up here shortly, but now we're developing two new standards, the TPI 2 and TPI 3. So the short answer to your question, why we have these standards, why do we keep updating these standards? Is that, we recognize that the standards provide credibility and acceptance of our product, and we keep updating them to make sure that the trusses remain on the cutting edge of research and technology, and both for public safety and for competitive issues, keep us competitive in the building industry. So that's really why we're doing this. But yeah, we do have two new standards that we're developing, and we can get into those.
Yeah, let's start by talking about TPI 2, which you are calling the National Standard for Testing Metal Plate Connected Wood Trusses. Let's talk a little bit about what this standard is and what maybe some of the goals the project committee has going into the process.
Sure. So yeah, we have two standards, TPI 2 and TPI 3, and we'll start with TPI 2. And I'll call them new, but they really aren't new standards. They just aren't ANSI standards. The TPI 2 standard really already exists. It resides right now in the commentary of the TPI 1 standard. It's a non-mandatory standard. It was developed and finished by TPI TAC. But now our goal is to run that standard through the ANSI process. So it is, it's an accredited ANSI standard that can be adopted into the building codes. Right now, it is not referenced. TPI 2 standard is not referenced in the building codes. And what the TPI 2 standard is, like you mentioned in the title, is a testing standard for wood trusses. It provides something for our industry to point to for engineers and code officials that need guidance on testing wood trusses, which currently, doesn't exist in the code right now.
Mm-hmm. Let's back up just a second, because turning something that exists into an ANSI standard, accredited standard, we should probably provide a little context on that. So what's the ANSI process, like in general terms? Like what's required of something in order for it to go from, I guess, the document it is now, right, into an actual recognized accredited ANSI standard? Like
Right. Okay, so so the ANSI process, it's really the standard for creating standards. Anybody can write up a standard. TPI could write up a standard, but to create an ANSI standard, you have to follow certain procedures and protocols to go to achieve a certification by ANSI. ANSI doesn't do anything with the content, doesn't certify the content of the standard. It just certifies that you've gone through a process that they have developed to make it a fair and balanced process so that all stakeholders in the industry have a say in the process. So basically what we have to do is we have to form a project committee that's a balanced project committee, meaning it's not just people in, directly in our TPI or in our industry. We have to open it up so we have users of the standard, producers of components or products that are used by the standard in general interest. Could be used, could be homeowners, could be academic members. So we have to have a balanced committee that develops or reviews the standard. That's part of the process. So we develop the committee, and then we go through a process of submitting proposals from the committee or ones that we received from the public, and review those proposals. And once we get to a certain point, we actually go to a vote where we have to achieve consensus on what we want to change or what we want to add to the standard. So it's a long process. We have to make sure we cross all our T's and dot our I's when we're going through this process, because we get audited by ANSI after the process is over to make sure they'll give us the final approval to ensure that we've made it an open and fair process. So that's really basically what we have to go through. It's a pretty rigorous process, but it's good for the industry, and it ensures that the standard isn't just developed by one organization. It's an open process that's going to be good for all stakeholders. And once you get this accreditation as an ANSI standard, it's much easier to incorporate this into the model building codes. The ICC is much more apt to reference an ANSI standard than one that's just developed by a certain organization.
So Jay, in the case of TPI2, this testing standard, you sort of talked about who the users would potentially be once it gets referenced in the building code. But like on this initial side of things, like, do you have any aspirations, goals, objectives, other than turning it into a standard, that are sort of on your short list of things that you hope to see happen?
Well, like I said, it's a pretty well-established standard right now. So we don't anticipate a whole lot of change to what we have right now, but we just want to make sure that we open it up and have it reviewed by anyone that's interested or has, does trust testing, to give them an opportunity to review it and give suggestions for any modifications that might be needed. And again, we really aren't anticipating much change to this, but we want to make sure it goes through the process. One thing I want to point out, something that's in TPI 2 that's really important, is that there are two distinctly different types of testing. There's testing when you want to just confirm a design method. Say you're designing for TPI 1 and you want to confirm that this truss that you've designed for TPI 1 works as you designed it. That's confirmation testing. Then there's another objective that's distinctly different. It's when you're testing, I want to say from scratch, and you have no idea what this product is going to do, and you want to establish design values. Well, that takes a whole lot more testing than just confirmation testing. And that's not really widely understood in I would say, the industry. So we want to just really make sure that's understood so we don't get, I'll say, bad testing out there. Somebody just comes into the market and says, I'm going to test this and get design values, bring it to the market. Well, we want to make sure that we're all playing by the same rules and we're testing appropriately. So that's really our goal, is to get that information out there, get it into the code so we have something to point to.
Great. Well, let's move on to TPI 3 then, entitled the National Design Standard for Bracing Metal Plate Connected Wood Trusses. Can you briefly describe sort of what that standard is? And again, if the project committee has any goals, what you're thinking on the front side here of what you're hoping to accomplish?
Sure. So again, TPI 3 it's not known as TPI 3 right now. It's an established design standard right now. It's currently known as DSB 2022. We may have talked about that earlier, but it's another standard it's not a ANSI standard. It's one that was completed through TAC and various SBCA and various other individuals in the industry that we use right now, but we want to move that along to open it up and make sure that it is a ANSI accredited standard so we can reference it in the building codes. What TPI 3 is right now, you might think like, what do we do? I thought we just did BCSI. Why are we doing TPI 3? Aren't they competing? Aren't they the same? And they really aren't. BCSI, as your listeners probably know, is really the guide that we use for bracing trusses, what framers can use to reference to brace trusses. And what BCSI is a prescriptive guide, so they can look at the truss design drawings and install the bracing properly. What TPI 3, how it differs from BCSI is TPI 3 is really the basis for BCSI. It provides the design calculations that are used to develop BCSI. So if you're going to actually design bracing from scratch, you would use it'll be called TPI 3. And that's, again, what was used those methods in TPI 3 were used to develop the BCSI guide. So if an engineer is going to actually design the bracing from scratch, not using a BCSI document, they could use the TPI 3. And the reason they would do that, 99% of the time, BCSI is going to be the document that's used. The reason why an engineer might use this TPI 3 document is you may have a structure that's outside the envelope of the BCSI guide document. So they can actually use that and tailor their truss or bracing design to what they need, in particular to what structure they have. Say it's like trusses that are over 60 feet or wide space trusses, something like that. It's not going to be used that often, but it's, again, something that the industry can point to. If an engineer needs that or a code official needs that, something we can point to and will be referenced in the code.
Excellent. So, ultimately, the question here is, how are these revisions of these two standards going to impact what we do, what our industry does? What value does having these two standards become ANSI standards? What does that provide to the component manufacturer and the rest of the industry?
Well, frankly, Sean, it's not going to be a big impact on the industry. You're not going to see big changes when we get this out. Like, wow, these things are out there. It's going to change everything. Really, this is just filling a void, filling a small gap that's out there that we need to have as something to point to. These methods are already established. It's really kind of just finishing up the process and getting them in the codes. So we're still going to be bracing trusses the same way. We're hopefully still testing the trusses the same way. So it's not really going to be a big impact on the industry, but it will really tighten up the industry and make it a little more credible.
Well, probably that last word's the most important one, right? We are constantly seeking pathways forward that raise the professionalism of our industry, raise awareness of our industry, and ultimately make sure that everybody who's touching our industry is being successful. And having these two turned into code-referenced ANSI standards helps accomplish that, right?
Right, exactly.
All right. So nobody needs to hit the panic button, but we'll follow this with interest. And when it's done, I'm sure that the next step then is that TPI will be working, I'm assuming, with SBCA to get these inserted into whatever the next appropriate code cycle is, right?
That's exactly right. And follow up on that, since these are two established standards right now, we're anticipating that the process isn't going to take a whole lot of time. Like some of these, if you're starting from scratch, this process can be 2-3 years long to get these from beginning to end. We're hoping to get these finished, at least the committee work, done by the end of this year, 2026. So it's a pretty aggressive schedule, but from what we're seeing, the feedback we're getting, we've already started. We got the project committee formed on each of these committees. We had a kickoff meeting last month. We're got the project committees are reviewing some of the content. And from what we're hearing from the committee, we don't anticipate a whole lot of change to what we've already got. So I think we can move the process along pretty quickly and hopefully get this done by the end of the year. Because in 2027, believe it or not, is 5 years since we did 2022 TPI 1 standards. So we're going to open that standard up again in 2027.
There's never rest for the weary there, Jay. Huh?
There you go. There you go.
Well, Jay, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your perspectives and insight into TPI 2 and TPI 3.
All right. Thanks so much for having me, Sean.
Well, and thank you everyone else for listening to this episode of SBCA's podcast, Component Connection. If you've enjoyed this episode and found it valuable, please like it and share it with others. Stay up to date and in the know by subscribing to Component Connection on whatever platform you use most.
Thanks for listening to Component Connection, brought to you by SBCA. If there's a topic you'd like us to explore in a future episode, email us at podcast@sbcacomponents.com.